Alright, so if you keep up with the channel, you probably note that I mainly work on my own stuff, but every once in a while an extenuating circumstance comes up and I'll take on another project. Well, here sits an extenuating circumstance. This is a motor that a guy asked me if I could put it together. He's on the other side of Tennessee over here. Put it back together for him because he started taking it apart, ran into some concerns, and he wanted to get me to check it out. Well, the big thing is that prior to him getting it, somebody had put the oil filter in backwards, and I'll show how to put that in a second. But in taking it apart, I didn't find too much that got damaged. So number one, I think either they crushed the filter when they put it in there and it was still getting some oil, or they left that orange O-ring out and so it was still getting a little bit of oil to flow. Because it definitely took out the rockers, but it didn't seem to hurt much else. So that got me thinking it'd be pretty interesting to see how the oil flows in these motors. So what I did is I actually took an old motor, and don't feel sorry for this motor. It was rode hard and put up wet and has seen better days. So wasn't going to be a usable motor anyway. You could use some pieces off of it. But I decided to cut this guy in half so we can see how the oil flows. So I separated everything out, and we got the pump over here, and then we got some clear tubing that runs along wherever the oil flows. And we can see how it goes through this motor because it's really, really interesting. All the little cross drillings and all the little ports that go through this motor to make this oil flow. So let's get the camera set down and we'll go through how the oil flows in this motor, and then we can see just exactly what Yamaha did to keep this thing running for 40 some odd years. Alright, so if we start where it all begins with the little pump right there. Now that guy normally resides right inside of there underneath the flywheel, and so it's tucked away and it's connected to this side of the case. But I separated it out so we could see the flow, because what I did is connected two tubes. Now it's interesting that there's two tubes because the way they set this up, if we look at the back of another one, right here is one of the outlets and over here is the other outlet, and it's two little pumps inside of one pump. This one down here goes to the transmission. This one up here goes to the combustion side, so over on to where the pistons and the cams and all that stuff is. But they're two separate little flows, and the bottom one going to the transmission is actually unfiltered. This one is the one that has the filter that's over on the side cover. So pretty neat how they put it together. They got two little pumps inside of one little pump. But what it does, and I'll walk through here, and we'll start with the transmission side because it's the easiest one. It doesn't flow around too much on it. So if we start out in our little lower tube, it goes back over where it would have been bolted up to the case, goes through some cross drillings, and if I can get it around there, comes back up through this little tube right here, and then it heads on up into the transmission. So it goes down and it goes and feeds one of these, comes down, it actually feeds the shaft. This is the shaft right here where you push your clutch and it opens the clutch up, so it feeds that. Then it cruises on around to the other side over here and it feeds the bearings on the back side. There's the little clutch pusher that pushes in and out when you pull the lever to make your clutch. It also has holes up here. This hole is for the clutch nest, and so it is inside of here, so it feeds that nest. When you pull the clutch in, it lets this guy spin, and so it's got to have some oil inside of its little bushings there. Then it goes on around, goes across to the other side on this tube, heads over here, oils up some bearings on this side, comes back out, that little red one right there, and it heads back over and it goes back into the drive system right here. So this is where it comes out on the output of the motor. So we'll get set up here and we'll see how this flows because it's really interesting. You can see the oil come in and out. Also, it's interesting that when you pressurize it, this little guy right here gets so much pressure it actually pushes out a little bit. But you'll see the oil flow on the transmission side in just a second, and then you'll see how all this works. Alright, so right now we're going to disconnect the combustion side. So that's the one, it's just going to pump back in the bucket so I don't waste as much oil. But we got the little transmission one connected right there, and I got me a little DeWalt that I can clip the battery into and we can make it pump. So when I fire this thing up, you'll see the oil start flowing through this tube right here. Then we'll come around and we'll see where the oil goes. So let me get her clicked on here. You can see now it turned black. So it's pumping oil into the transmission side. Well, then you can see right here it comes on across after it's filled up that side, heads on over to the bearings over on this side of the case. It's going to lubricate them, and then as it's pumping along it starts coming back, and you'll see it coming back through this pipe to lubricate the output system. We'll give it another click on our dewalt. And now you can see it flowing. So it's running really slow right now, but you can see the oil flowing through the pipe, and it's headed on over to the final drive. Well, now we got oil dripping out, so you can see right here, this is coming out of the little hole that goes into the clutch nest, and so that's lubricating those bushings that are over there. Here is your clutch pusher, and so it is when you engage the clutch lever, it starts pushing that back and forth, so it's got oil inside of it. And you can see when I move it, I get more oil out there when I push it back. So what it's doing is when you push the clutch, it puts that much more oil into the clutch nest. When it's back, it cuts it off a little bit and lets it flow onto the other parts of the transmission. So away it goes. It's pouring oil out all over the place where it's feeding this transmission system. And you can see here it starts coming out right there. That's the little piston that pushes when you push the clutch lever. You can see I can push it in. Well, it's all in that entire rod right there. Oils up all of this stuff, and we're good to go. So let me get this thing disconnected, and then we can look and see what it doesn't oil on the transmission. Alright, so as we could see from the transmission side of the little pump, that it pumps up oil into all the little bearings and everywhere. But what about all these gears? How do these gears get oil? Well, I put a piece of black tape across here, and you can see the tape. This is actually about the height of the oil level when it's at the top of the little sight glass over there. So as you can see, when your oil level's up good and high, these guys right here actually dip down into the oil. And so they're lubricating by grabbing the oil up out of the sump down here, and they're picking it up and throwing it all over the gears. So they're lubricating off of those gears. Well, that works pretty good. One thing to note is that for the counterbalance, it actually comes really close. If I rotated it around, you would see that the counterbalance dips in just a little bit, just enough to get some oil on it to throw some oil up onto the bearings, give it a little bit extra. So as we can see, the gears dip down. So that's why it's really important when you're filling it up with oil is to make sure you're staying at the top of the sight glass, because these gears don't get any oil if you get down too low. And that's why the oil light comes on the bikes to let you know you're running low on oil, because it's not going to lubricate these gears. So there we go. That's how the transmission works pretty much. And like I say, it oils all the way over to the output on the motor, and so everything stays nice and oily. So now let's swing over to the motor side, or the combustion side of the motor, because it gets real interesting. The oil flows everywhere around this thing, but it doesn't actually pump it in some cases. It actually squirts it. Alright, so for the transmission side, it was pretty simple. The oil just feeds the bearings through the oil circuit, and then the gears dip down and splash in. But for the motor side, the combustion side, it's quite complicated because they couldn't flow oil to every single thing that moves in there. So it uses some oil flow, and then it uses some squirting of the oil, and then it also uses some drain back that lubricates the gears and things. So it starts in the same spot though, with the little pump right here, and this is the one that's feeding through the motor to feed the pistons and the cams and the rockers and all that. Well, it doesn't really do much over here. It just goes through this side of the case. Then, if the cases were together, it would go into the other side right over here. So this is my little tube that connects them together. From there, if you could see, let me get the camera over here and get the light. So if we zoom in here, right behind the pipe and right behind that washer that I got it holding in there, you can see right there, right behind that is a little bitty pipe, and what that is the bypass. And so when it reaches too much pressure at high RPMs, that little guy right there bypasses oil and it dumps back down and it goes in between the case again. So there's a little bypass right there, pressure bypass, sandwiched between the cases that you have to split the case if you want to take that little guy out. So then it heads on through some cross drillings on the inside here, and it heads on over to where the oil filter is. So let's go over there and see what about this oil filter. All right, so the oil flows from the other side of the case where the little pump is into here, and this is where the oil filter goes. Now the problem we ran into on that other motor is that somebody turned it around backwards, and so that's backwards. It needs to go with the hole towards the cover for the oil filter. So if we look at what happened with this oil filter being turned around backwards, and these are ones I make, got gauges on them, I like to see the pressure so I know my little motor's healthy. But what happens is normally the hole on the inside goes towards the cover. Well, what happened when they flipped it over is basically it blocked off the cross drilling that goes inside of the cover, comes out here, because that little hole right there is the one that's feeding the entire motor on the combustion side. So when it's flipped around backwards, it blocks it off. So the reason why that motor over there probably survived is when they put it in, they crushed it or something, or there's a little orange O-ring that sits around this outside. If you leave that off, it'll bypass the filter just a little, and it'll give it enough oil that it can stay running, but you're not filtering anything. All right, so let's head on and see where our oil goes from here. So now we're looking at the inside of the right side cover, and so that is the inside of the oil filter cover right over here. The oil filter sits in here like that and goes up against that cover. So my pipe here is letting the oil flow into the cover, and it's going to come out. Well, it goes two directions. One is a big pipe right here. It flows back into the crank. Up above it is a smaller pipe right here. This is the pipe that goes up to the heads, and so it comes back in. So we'll zoom around here on this side and you can see where it flows in. So over here we got the big pipe that came from the bottom. It's going directly to the crank. The crank ties to the side cover on the right side over there. The upper one is this little guy right here. It comes over and it goes up and it goes into the two little fittings on the outside, and that's what goes up and that's what feeds the head. So what about this little fitting? We'll talk about him for just a minute. Alright, so what's up with this little double banjo here, and why do I say that he's special? Well, inside of there they actually drilled it really small, and so it's restricting the amount of oil that can go up to the heads, because they want to make sure they're driving a lot of oil through the lower where the crank connects up to the side cover. So they've got a restrictor in here because you can't control which way it's going. Now that it's in a parallel path, you got to restrict it down with one. And that's what they did in that little double banjo right there. So then it heads on up here, and it comes up to the heads. It enters another banjo, and this is where it starts getting into the rockers and the bearings on the cams and things like that. So we'll swing around on the inside, have a look at that. Then we'll go down and we'll look at the connecting rods and how it squirts oil through the connecting rods, because they don't have a drilling all the way up on top of them. They actually squirt out the side. So we'll show that in a minute once I fire this thing up. So now for the heads, what you have is actually the fluid comes in, the oil comes in through the banjo, comes into the front one. It's got a drilling this way, so part of the oil goes down to the back side of the cam. This is the cam right there, so normally that sits inside of here, goes to the back side, lubricates the back side of the cam. Then the cam is hollow, so the oil flows through the cam, comes out the front, and lubricates that aluminum bearing that's sitting in the front of the cam right there. Then after it does all that, it dribbles down, and then it'll run on out of the head. In the meantime, we got another couple of parallel paths, so we're starting to divide our oil flow up. Well, this one is actually the pin that goes to the rocker. So you can see the rocker sitting right there, sitting on top of the cam. It's got another one, comes back out of the center, goes over to this rocker pin, goes inside the rocker pin, and it lubricates the rocker. Well, if you look at the rocker, there's a teeny weeny little hole right there that it feeds, and that's one of the smallest holes in this whole upper circuit to the head. So starts to explain why if the oil flow is limited, you're not going to get any oil on those rockers, because all of these other cross drillings and holes and all that, they are much, much bigger than that tiny little hole right there. So it is going to not get much oil, because the oil is just going to take the path of least resistance. So now we're starting to understand why the rockers failed, but not much else failed. But if we're talking about the other part that went bad, it was actually that aluminum bearing that sits inside the front here for the front side of the cam on the back head. Well, it's kind of the end of the journey there for the whole thing. So this one went bad. That aluminum bushing inside of there went bad on that motor on the table, because it's like the last leg before it goes back down into the motor, and that one got worn as well. So we can replace that one out. But fortunately, the backside was still getting some oil, so the head itself is okay. So let's head on down and see where this oil goes once it comes out of the head. Alright, so here's the front of the cam, and there's the chain and all that. So if we pop all this off and just let it fall down in there, what we got is, if I get the flashlight in there, normally you'll have your chain guide. So there's the chain guide sitting up in there. And so if we can get it to sit there for a second, if I get the flashlight, you can see that right beside the chain guide, right down in there where the flashlight's shining, there is a port. Well, that is the return port for the oil that went up into the heads. And what it's doing is it's returning right beside the slide right there, right beside the chain guide. And so what it's doing is lubricating the chain. Well, the chain takes it all the way back down to the bottom and lubricates everybody else. So if I shine the light through the hole right inside of there, see that hole right there? So that little hole, if I shine the light, it actually comes out over on this side of the head. It is right there inside the head. So you can see the light right there. That's where all the oil comes back down out of the heads, goes back through that little hole, and it runs right down beside the chain and lubricates everything as it goes down. Even where the intermediate gear sits, right inside of this pocket right here, there's little grooves notched out, if you can see them right at the top up there. Little groove right there notched out, and all the oil that dribbles down the side gets on that pin, lubricates that pin as well on the front and the back. So that's how the oil gets back down, and as it's cruising back down to get back down to the bottom, it's actually lubricating that whole system that runs the heads. So that pretty much shows how it gets up to the heads and back down. Now we got this other parallel circuit that was running, and it's what goes over to the crank. So let's look at that real quick and see how you're oiling the connecting rods. Alright, so it's a little hard to see down in there what's going on. So over here to the side is a connecting rod. And so this is the connecting rod that goes down to the crank, goes up to the piston. But what they did, instead of drilling all the way up through the connecting rod like some cars and things so the oil can flow up and get to the wrist pin and lubricate the oil slides and all that kind of stuff, what they did is they actually drilled a little hole. And so you can see right here I got a nail stuck in it. So there's a hole right here, and what it becomes is kind of like an oil squirter. So as the connecting rod is going around and around, there's two holes in the crank that line up with this little hole every 180 degrees. So every time it comes around and those holes line up, it squirts a bunch of oil out, and it lubricates the jug from the bottom side, throws oil all up underneath the piston and all that. So that's how they made it super simple, by just putting a hole right through there. Now, when you're doing your bearings and you're taking these out, these connecting rods have to go in the right way, and you also have to make sure you line that little hole up with your new bearing, because that oil has to get right through there. So for these, if you're wanting a reference, they say that one side of it has a Y on it. Let me see if I can see it. Yeah, so one side has a Y. So the Y on both of the connecting rods goes to the left side of the motor. So I would put it in like that right there for the front and for the back. And what that does is allow the oil to squirt up properly underneath the jug. If you put it around backwards, it's not going to squirt in the right place, and you're going to burn your motor up. So that's pretty simple how they did it, and it just throws it up all over the place, throws it all over the gears, throws it all over everything, runs back down, lubricates the two big roller bearings that are on the side of the motor, and away we go. So now that we know how it flows, let's hook our little pump up, and we're going to watch it flow around, and you can see where it all comes out. Alright, so with our little pump connected up to the combustion side, the transmission is disconnected right down there just so I don't waste any more oil than I have to. Let's get it fired up. Now, I do have the crank positioned where the holes don't line up because it would just squirt out of there real easy. So that's not lined up right now, but after we see how the flow goes through this whole motor, then I'll open up that little hole right there and I'll show you the difference in like 60 psi, which is the bypass, about what the bypass does, and about 10 psi, which would be when the motor's warmed up and you got old oil in it, you only get about 10 psi. We'll see how high the little squirter goes for each of those. So let's fire this thing up and we'll go chase around and see how the oil flows. If we turn our pump on, we got the oil flowing, and so it heads over here. And you can see it flowing up, and it starts flowing up to the head. So now we're oiling and we're coming into the heads right here. You can see the oil coming across slowly but surely, and it starts running out of all of the little flow holes. Runs out of the crank, front and the back, and it starts running out of right there on the rocker. You can see it running. Well, this one's feeding as well, but because that hole is so tiny, you can see there's hardly any oil coming out of that rocker right there. And so now you can see with all that oil flowing, dripping down everywhere out of this head, and all that would run right back down in here. There's still not a lot coming out of the rockers compared to all the oil that is pouring out of this thing. Alright, so that's the head side of it. Now the crank side, it runs down through there, right through the middle of the bearing, and it's going over to the crank, and it's lubing the crank down in there, and you can see some oil coming out. Well, I got the little hole blocked off, so it's not pumping any up in the air, but it's pumping to the crank. But the biggest thing you see is that with all that oil running, you can see how it feeds these rockers, but just like this little rocker right here, the one in front, we're not getting any flow at all. And it's got a hole in it, but it's just the smallest hole. So that's why those rockers will go first, because everything else down here is getting pretty good oil. Alright, so let's disconnect the little pin that's holding that port closed on the crank down there, and we'll see just how high this oil squirts out of that little hole every time it comes around and makes its 180-degree turn in order to squirt some oil right up underneath the jugs. Alright, so just to show how much oil comes squirting out of that tiny little hole right down in there, so if you look right where my finger is, there's a little hole in the connecting rod. So what I'm going to do is disconnect the oil line coming over to the crank, and I'm going to squirt 60 psi worth of air pressure in there, and then you can see just how much oil comes up at 60 psi, and then I'll drop it down to 10, and you can see why it's really important not to let these bikes sit in idle. So if we put 60 psi in there for just a second, and you watch that little squirt right down in there, this is what the distance it goes up at 60. So you can see it went crazy high. It goes all the way to the ceiling up there. I actually got it on my wall, got it everywhere. If you move the camera around, you can see just how high it went. It blew it all the way up on my wall, all the way up to the ceiling up there. So that's 60 psi, so it is pumping a bunch of oil out of those little bitty holes that are in the connecting rods, and it is just blowing oil everywhere. So that's where the majority of the oil goes. So not a lot goes up to the heads up there to lubricate all that. The majority of that oil, every 180 degrees, it makes a big, huge squirt like that, and it squirts it out. So now let me drop the pressure down to about 10 psi, and we'll see what, if you're running down at idle, what it looks like and how much oil is coming up. All right, so let's do that again at 10 psi and just watch the little oil flow right there coming out. This would be what you're getting at idle. You can see you're getting just a very small stream until it blew the air out. But the stream at 10 psi is not enough to get up inside of the jugs very well. So that's why it's really important to check and make sure you don't have a bunch of gas down inside of your oil, like the carbs are leaking or something like that, because it gets thinner and then it just doesn't pump very good at all. You get really low pressure and you won't pressurize that oil flow coming out underneath those jugs. All right, so there we go. A little bit of fun with an old worn out motor to see how the oil flows through all of this. So really interesting for me to see how, as it goes through its parallel paths, the restrictions that they put in there control the flow. But unfortunately, these little guys right here don't get much oil at all when you do something like put the filter in backwards, or you limit the flow, like a filter stopped up or something like that. These guys are the first to go, and that explains why on that other motor over there that the rockers went, but nothing else seemed to be too damaged. Well, alrighty. Hope that helped someone, or at least was interesting, and thanks for watching.